David Bohm Seminar Series 1, Sunday, November 13th, 1988, 4 o'clock afternoon session, Ojai, California.
Right. Well, maybe we could begin with a few questions, and there'll be some more things we could talk about later.
This morning about action that engages the unlimited.
Yes. Yeah, well, it means, see, if we're acting towards something, and if we say limited, like anything, not a thing, object, or you're acting toward it, but we have to say, what does that mean, right, in this new representation?
Action that engages the unlimited.
Yeah, well, we say if everything is the unlimited, then action must engage the unlimited, you see. Otherwise, I don't see what it means, right? So we're not clear how it engages the unlimited. It appears to be engaging the limited, right? But it actually must be thought of as engaging the unlimited, right?
We say the unlimited is unknowable.
Yes.
But can there be an awareness without knowing?
Well, perhaps, you see, but certainly we can be in contact with it in some way. And see, we could say every action is the unlimited engaged with the unlimited, but we are, the representation and the presentation is guiding that action. Right? You see, let's try to make a picture. You see, I think Joe was saying before that the brain is constructing this whole consciousness of the world. Now, it's useful to think about people who were blind from birth and had an operation they could see, right? Now, there are all sorts of experiences. For example, they find they don't see depth or anything like that because they never experienced it before, right? Up and down, right? They see very little about up and down. Now, it's not being presented to them, you see. Because now, also they can tell the things that they've touched. You see, the man was living in a house where the doors had uppercase letters embossed on them, so he could touch them. So the minute he could see, he recognized uppercase letters, but no lowercase letters, right? You see that, in other words, there's a connection between the sense of touch and the sense of sight. And he was able to, he had already made a representation through the sense of touch, which made contact with the sense of sight, right? Now, for the uppercase letters anyway. Now, for depth, it's much harder for up and down. Now, because, you see, a blind man doesn't realize how much he's going up and down, and he doesn't realize about the walls and all that, and if he'd never seen before. So, but then there was another interesting case, I don't know, which seemed much more surprising, which was the minute he could see, he was asked, well, what do you see? What do you sense? He says, oh, some sensation on my skin. In other words, he felt the light on his skin, right? Namely the retina. He was actually feeling what was happening, right? Now, he didn't see a world, he didn't see depth, he didn't see space. That all had to be learned, right? So you see, he had to learn by experience and by thinking about it to represent it. And then he gradually up to a point that they seldom really achieve what can be achieved by, very often that such people would rather close their eyes and return to touch, right? But the point is that you can see that whatever the light arrives at the retina of the eye, and somehow the brain constructs this, and it's got to learn to construct it, right? And you can test it, for example, they give people spectacles, prismatic spectacles, which displace everything. So they see the world in the wrong place, but you see, they don't move toward that which they see. In other words, they think they're moving toward that which they see, and they find they're not getting there, right? They're not engaging the thing properly. But then gradually it gets corrected, so they begin to see it, so that their movement and their vision are in line, right? Then when they take off the spectacles, they're out of line again, and it takes time to get back in line. So you can see that action involves a certain relation between what is constructed in the brain and what happens, right? It's directed by the state of the brain. But if it's misdirected, your action, like the fellow doesn't arrive where he expects, and then the brain starts to change the whole arrangement. Huh? So you see that there is an arrangement partly learned and partly hereditary of making this possible, right? Now, so you can say that's already clear that the world that you see is constructed, but if it's constructed in such a way as to lead to coherent action, then that's really what it was set up to do, right? Now, now suppose we now go further and say all these things which we see are really only abstractions. They are the result of representations, right? Yet they cannot be just arbitrary. You see, you couldn't just shift the spectacles around in any old way and get the right action. So there must be some, we say the true being of each one of these things is the unlimited. The true being of ourselves is the unlimited. Now, but this whole process of abstraction, representation, and presentation directs our action so that it engages this unlimited in a coherent way. Is that clear what I mean? That's the picture, right?
Is this related in any way to what Krishnamurti used to call an action which is whole or complete?
Well, it might be. We could perhaps come to that later. I think that we'd have to go into the question of time before that, you see, and maybe we should come to that a little later. But you can see that the action must be toward the unlimited and properly directed toward the unlimited, right? Now, in the case of objects which we perceive through the senses, then we learn how to do that, you see, in a certain way, right? Right. Any more questions anyone wants to raise?
You said Friday and then other discussions that man must have great significance to the ground or the unlimited, which I think are the same, and that if a few of us go into this and understand it, it must have great significance. I wonder if you could go into that a little more.
Yes. Well, I'll say a little now and perhaps return to it later, right? That you see we've been generally living by giving total significance to the limited. You see, that's the way this literal thought goes, right? And as if it's the limited were all there is, which in fact the literal thought is assuming, right? And it gives very high value to the limited, right? It gives the value of the unlimited value to the limited, which is where the trouble was we discussed this morning about the ego. And now, if thought, if we see that the unlimited value has to go to the unlimited, that would be the right way.
But that's sort of from us to the limited, like man giving the value to the unlimited instead of, the question was more of the value coming the other way, of man to the unlimited.
Well, from man to the unlimited, which way?
The value that the unlimited has for man.
Well, that we can't say. You see, that's speculative. But you can explore that. But you see, I'm trying to say the first thing is the unlimited can have no value for man unless man is open to the unlimited, and therefore unless he gives it total value. Right? Otherwise, the unlimited has no value as far as the unlimited can do nothing. You see, it has no power. The unlimited. Because if it has power, it's got to be limited in some way.
Part of that comes from the idea that value exists separate from what gives it value. The kind of feeling that I have about value, that there is a value that's beyond anything that could value it. But what sort of sounds like that value is a relationship more than...
Yeah, well, value is some sort of sense of priority or some sort of sense of importance, you see, and giving priority is one way of looking at it. So, you see, suppose we say, to what do we give priority? Now, if you're living in ordinary society, you give priority to whatever. You may give it to money or to whatever you're doing. You know, you have all sorts of things to which you could give priority, and different people do it differently, right? And however, if you give the first priority to that, then you cannot be giving it to the unlimited. Therefore, your brain is not sensitive to the unlimited, right? It even is effectively saying there isn't any such thing as the unlimited, right? How could you ever give priority to it? See, perhaps I could explain this with a sort of a story, that a plot for a science fiction story. That you see, the story is that there are various beings who were exploring the universe and using spaceships from various other stars, and the way they did it was with robots, which would have a very good, very developed robots, which would have an onboard computer to deal with local problems. They would be connected to a central computer, which would have a program for each robot and connect them all together, and so on. You see, so the point now is the robots came to a certain planet and started to explore it, and they went into a very deep cave and lost contact with the central computer. And then they began to think on their own that they were independent, you see. That thought became established, that became established, and that they were, therefore each one thought it was supreme, right? And that therefore there was no room in there for the thought about the central computer anymore. So the robots came out and they became confused and began to destroy each other and do all sorts of things because each one was supreme. And the central computer sent various robots to try to communicate. You see, and some of these were destroyed, some were worshipped, and to some both happened. And the problem still has not been solved. You see, so so you could say that perhaps, you see, the brain is able to deals with certain things in itself, but maybe one of its functions would be to be sensitive to more subtle levels of, a being, which, so the brain could function more as an antenna or something to pick up this than something which would be the initiator of action, right? You see, that's just a suggestion. You see, but on the other hand, if literal thought would say, no, that just doesn't, not possible. You see, there's no point in even thinking it, right? But it may well be that the brain cannot bring itself to order completely without that sort of thing, right?
In one sense, we don't need to concern ourselves with that, in that if we see that our literal thought is limited, that's enough.
Yeah, well then we don't know whether this is true or not. You see, this is only a story, right? But maybe like a myth, it could, you see, in primitive times, myths were means of representing something, right? Later they they were taken too literally, right? They didn't work right anymore. So the point is that if we don't know whether this is so or not, but it just opens up the possibility, right? And we say, okay, if the brain quiets down and ceases to interfere, and so on, if this literal thought does not go too far, and so on, then the thing may work differently. We may find out.
99% of the time we're living in the 1% of our thoughts, whereas only 1% of the time are we living in the 99% of what we really are.
Yes, or even less than 1%, maybe, yes, you see.
99.999.
Yeah. You see, society has grown up in such a way as to, that the collective representations keep on pushing that out, right? Now, You see, what we can say is we can sort of play around with different representations without necessarily believing they're literally true. You see, this is the important point, that if we start to believe that our representation is literally true, we'll have established another religion which will fight all the others, right?
We need to free play with it.
Yeah.
Kind that we are disconnected from the unlimited.
No, but we may prevent it from entering our consciousness, you see. In other words, we're always connected, but by occupying, the brain occupying itself with the limited completely, there's no way for it to respond to the unlimited, right?
What kind of relationship is between two people who one is engaged to his action are, let's say, directed in the engagement with the unlimited, even if the person is not conscious about it, and the other one is not? Is there any possibility to be a relationship between these two people?
Well, I don't know. You see, well, it's like these computers. You know, those computers coming from the central computer that wanted to communicate with the robots. You see. The question is, how can they do it? I say the problem hasn't been solved, right? You see, the central computer has no power over these robots, you see. You see, having power is already a sign of separation, right? Exerting power, right? Over something.
It seems like fighting is only the only way for communication.
Well, but then they would both be engaged in the same game, right?
Like the children.
You see, they're both in the same game. Then you see that the point is that how is it possible to communicate with somebody who doesn't want to pay any attention? You see.
Sorry, going back, power is already separation.
Yeah, the power over something. You see that. There's a kind of power that may not be energy, but I'm trying to say power in the usual sense, right? That people want, right? It's like saying the central computer ought to be more powerful than these robots, ought to be able to compel them to behave, right?
Still hasn't clicked.
What? Well, I'm saying one view of it is the way the ordinary, from the point of view of literal thought, you would say the solution that is simple. The central computer is more powerful than the robots and could compel them to behave the way it wants, huh? But I say that won't make any sense. It's like saying God is all-powerful and he could compel people to do anything he wants, you see. Then you ask, why isn't he doing it? You see, or is what's going on his will, you see. Then you say, what?
Robots are preoccupying the circuits?
What?
You're saying the robots are preoccupying the circuits?
The circuits of the robots are filled by their own self-induced activity and cannot listen.
The computer can have no effect.
Yeah, the central computer can't just take a hammer or a screwdriver and force them to obey, right? See, that was with Hal. They might turn it off, but I mean, it still can't force Hal to be sane, right?
Isn't that something like the parable in the Bible about the seed on the ground and the road that the ravens took? And the one that fell in the dry, it did root for a few days and died, but there's a seed that fell on the fertile ground that took root and gave 100-fold. It's something like that, if you can listen and be aware.
Yeah, well, if that's right, yes.
Sorry, it's still not clear why if the unlimited, why the unlimited cannot exert a power on the limited.
Well, it might, you see, but I'm trying to say there seems to be a contradiction in there.
I can't see the contradiction.
You see, the point is, if it did it, power acts externally, you see, to force something to happen, right? And therefore it wouldn't be the right thing, you see.
Authority.
What?
It would be an authority.
Yeah, and it would also not be the right thing, which is it must be coming from the depths, you see.
It would imply a separation.
Yeah, it would imply a separation, a wrong order, you see. To act on something with power is to impose an external form on it. An external, you see.
So it would create the opposite result.
Yeah, it would create the wrong result, right?
When
one says the will of God, then that's an attempt to give the unlimited power.
Yeah, you see,
The whole thing.
it's power in the sense that people have in mind when they are thinking of power, in government and so on, is not the sort of thing that would be relevant. There is the power to create, you see. But that's different, right?
An energy to create.
Power is one of our ways of looking at things,
Yeah.
isn't necessarily the universe's way of looking at things.
Yes, you see, we come back to this idea of end and means, right? And this power has an end in view, and it finds a means to do it, and exerts the power to try to achieve it, right? Which makes it all external and separate, right? From the one who exerts. You see, so the whole thing would not be right, you see. Now, so we have a sort of a question which has not been answered, perhaps not even by the unlimited, you see, I don't know.
It would not be right if it's separate, but if you have, like, say, a personal computer, where normally the keyboard basically dictates what the computer will do because it's connected by a cord to the keyboard. The keyboard to the processor. The keyboard is a part of the entire unit. If you disconnect the keyboard, it no longer is a part of the computer. It no longer has power over it to direct its actions. But when that connection is made,
yeah, well, essentially, it's not power. What you're communicating to the computer a certain amount of information. You see, and the question is, will the computer accept it, and so on. Now, suppose you have this case where the computer had a virus, wrong program, which, first of all, it was very interesting. It just occupied the computer so thoroughly it couldn't do anything else. That was the first thing it did wrong, right? So it couldn't listen to the commands coming from the information coming from the keyboard, right? It was so occupied with the virus that that's all it could do, right? Now, if the computer had also begun still more extensive operations, the virus had produced all sorts of things. It could overload the computer, make it burn out, you see, or it could, in some cases apparently it can, or it could get it to do all sorts of very subtle destructive things, which would only be detected very much later. It could put programs into all the computers all over the country to do all sorts of destructive things, but they would be delayed. They wouldn't act for a long time, and nobody would know they're in there. Like these delayed viruses. So the point is then that the computer is programmed to reject the information from the keyboard, right? So the keyboard can put into the computer a program which would make it reject it.
but most keyboards have a reset button that stops the computer.
Yeah, but in this case of the virus, it was too subtle that the computer did not have, the reset button didn't have the intelligence to detect the virus, you see. It didn't have an immune system, right? Maybe they will produce computers with immune systems.
It's scary, really, because
what?
it's scary. Because it seems that now the literal thought has really dissolved our immune system. It feels like that.
Yes, it has interfered with the immune system of the mind, right? Which would detect all sorts of false things, you see. And now, you see, in order to make a machine that will protect itself from all those things, it has to be intelligent enough to recognize them. And there can always be people who are clever enough to get past it. Even the viruses are always clever enough to get past the immune system or get past our drugs, which are aimed at them. You see, they just mutate a little and the drugs no longer work, or the penicillin doesn't work anymore. The immune system don't recognize it, and it goes through, right? So, therefore, the whole thing can easily develop in such a way. You see, we call that a disease, but I mean, this gentleman objected. But we can say it's some malfunction, something is going wrong, and and therefore this computer or this brain or whatever it is not going to pay attention to that which is really first priority.
It's worse than disease because it's the cause of the rest of the diseases.
Yes, it's the cause basically of all the diseases of society, and probably it produces an unhealthy state of the body, and and so on. So it contributes to all the physical diseases, and so on. It may interfere with the immune system, and so on. If people become depressed, it seems to be proved that the immune system is weak and it doesn't work. And there is a connection which people are exploring now between the brain and the immune system.
They go further and find that maybe this is the cause of the cancer.
It may be, yeah. You see, that could all happen. You see, that could all be discovered. You see, that it's all, the cancer is very similar to the computer virus. You see, it just keeps on growing. It contains instructions to make cells reproduce it all the time, and therefore, that's the way it goes. Now, so eventually, the system gets, at the very least, so occupied that it cannot listen to anything else, or it may get much more destructively occupied and actually start spreading destruction all over, you see, as happens to the cancer later, right? And now, that seems to be one of the possibilities in the whole system, you see. The system, any system which organizes information to be active like this will have this possibility, right? It cannot be avoided. Right? So therefore, that is a danger which comes, you see, when we have a highly organized system. Right? Now, still, there may be, the point is there not an intelligence which can deal with that? You see, now, and that raises the question, what is intelligence? So you could say the immune system can be thought of as a kind of intelligence that deals with the viruses, or, that may lose its intelligence or lose its suppleness. Now, and not deal with them. So what is intelligence? Well, we don't know exactly. People claim they're measuring intelligence with tests, and people in artificial intelligence claim they're going to make it artificially, though none of them has actually done so, or they're very far from it. Nobody, but still they work on it, and some of them must believe that it's possible. And so you see, we don't know what is intelligence. Now, the root of the word is interlegere, which means to choose or pick or gather from in between. You see, and you could say maybe that's a clue, because you see, we have categories that are fixed. Literal thought has categories that get fixed, saying that we represent things just as they are, right? Therefore, they get fixed. Intelligence doesn't respect that. It lets it go and says we can pick up information from in between the categories. They're not fixed, right? So the intelligence is not limited to any set of categories. It can be always new, right? On the other hand, if you're once fixed as to the way you think, then you try to find a solution that way, and perhaps you never can.
That's intellect.
Yeah, the intellect is the past participle of intelligence. So the intellect it's the same as thought, right? Thought is what you have been thinking, it becomes active, and the intellect is the intelligence now crystallized as thought, right, as memory. So it can act too, and it's necessary. But then tacitly, literal thought has led us to believe that the intellect is all there is, right? Therefore, that intelligence, in the sense I was using the word, is impossible. You see, now if it once do that, then it will be impossible, right? Once that's accepted. You cannot possibly let intelligence cannot work. See, the minute you make a representation in which it is impossible, then it becomes impossible. It is presented as impossible, and nothing can be done, right?
I get an idea here that, for instance, that most scientists and mathematicians do their work at a young age, and they're very, use the word, intelligent. They get in their system and it becomes intellect, and you find that when they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s, excluding you, excuse me, it's as if that they don't do great work after a certain young age. It's as if they're caught in their intellect and not to see between these categories in a new way. I wonder if you can read about the life of famous mathematicians and physicists, and you find that
Well,
as a general rule, that happens. Maybe not to everybody, but there's certainly.
Well, there's a tendency to happen. Yes, a strong tendency.
Even in the greatest minds in history.
Yeah. Yes, it gets more or less fixed. You see, the more experience you have, and it sort of gets deeper, and the grooves get deeper. And no.
It just happened to me, an ordinary man, but it happens to the greatest minds in history.
There's a tendency there, you see. There is a tendency, and some people have said, since it has happened, it's inevitable, and therefore that helps make it inevitable. Because some people may say, okay, it's happening, I must accept that there's no way out, right? And therefore it will go on, right? See, in other words, the way people think about thought, we were saying, they were engaging tacitly in thought of type B, and therefore that controlled, you see, but that was not very intelligent thought of type B, right? So it's very important what people are doing with thought of type B. And you see, the possibility of any change depends on bringing that out.
We think that if we classify all of our data accurately and can move about in it friskily and accurately, this is intelligence. We can come up with the answers from the past. But for instance, if we read a very difficult book, we don't get it, and then but a month or so later, it's as if we, in the meantime, we had been digesting the book unconsciously, and then all of a sudden we come up knowing this stuff. Would this be an aspect of intelligence?
Yes, I think that's part of it. You see, now I would like to suggest that intelligence involves more and more subtle levels of the mind, whatever that may be, and that the word subtle is an interesting word. It means, intangible, various words. Well, I can't remember all the meanings, but the main meaning I would like is its root, subtextary, meaning textary means to weave, as in textile, and subtle means finely woven, right? You see. Now you could imagine that you have a very fine, rather coarsely woven net, and a lot of stuff gets through it. And then you have a more finely woven net, which gets more of it, and so on. You see, so some things get through any net you make. And now, you see, so if we stick to certain kinds of nets, we will only pick up certain kinds of things, right? And intelligence must depend on, I say, unlimited possibility for subtlety. Now, that would suggest, perhaps eventually, but I brought in the word unlimited, you see. That would suggest maybe it comes from the unlimited, you see. Now, let me try to put it differently. Let's begin with the notice of awareness and attention, you see, which are in some way a bit beyond thought, or quite a bit, right? Awareness is a kind of sensitivity, as I would put it, wary, watchful, is its root. And sensitivity, for example, to subtle differences and similarities, it includes sensitivity to what is subtle, right? Rather than just to what is gross. Now, attention somehow brings it all together, you see. And but the point is that what you can be aware of and attentive to depends on the representation, which tells you what's worth watching, right? If the representation says that's not worth looking at, or it doesn't even exist, so why bother to look? You're not going to pay any attention to it. You see, you cannot pay attention. It's very difficult to pay attention beyond the representations that are accepted.
Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible by seeing the importance of it, and being this subtle awareness begins to see beyond those limits, right? That it is not really working quite right. See, if you're not very subtle, then you may miss. It goes through the net that it isn't working right. Do you follow me? You see, if you use a sort of gross kind of net, right, then it may not be working, but you don't see it because that fact slips through the net.
It gets finer and finer.
Yeah, the net gets finer and finer, and finally it doesn't slip through, right? More and more subtle, more and more sensitive.
reactions after reactions. That's all it is. It's just a reactive thing, this brain.
Yeah.
And as it becomes aware about what its reactions are, I might start noticing my gross reactions. What I mean,
Yeah.
I'll notice that I have a large reaction to certain things, and then as I keep looking at this, I'll be able to see my even more subtle reactions
Yes.
to my representation.
Yes, you'll be able to see subtly how your representations are affecting the way it looks to you, right?
Where the problem seems to be is this brain wants to think that it's seeing its subtle reactions to real things still.
Yeah, that's literal thought, right?
That it's actually I'm reacting to a vibe I feel in the room or something, right? Something like
Well,
that.
you could be reacting to all sorts of subtleties inside yourself. I mean, things that are not quite right or things that are connected. See, you'll become aware of connections that you didn't think were there.
Some of it could actually be happening.
Yeah. You see, another meaning of the word subtle is elusive. It tends to elude you, and another meaning is indefinable. Now, the meaning indefinable means that it cannot be limited, right? So therefore, the subtle is the way to the unlimited, right?
Talking about getting into a more sensitive, not necessarily that what we're doing doesn't have value in thought, but that thought is highly insensitive, and that if it would just stay in its place, the sensitivity that was possible would start weaving itself, and we could come in contact with a greater and more subtle sensitivity in the universe and stuff. These things we're talking about are not in contradiction to each other. They're like a continuum of possibilities, but that we've sort of got caught in one part of the continuum, and we're not moving, and our brains are sort of grinding themselves up into hamburger in our lives.
Yes, well, we're only...
The brain has lost its flexibility and pliability.
There's greater subtlety possible, and then more subtlety from that, and more and more and more sensitivity.
But you see, if it's occupied with all sorts of gross things, it's not going to be able to do it, right?
It isn't sensitive.
And the whole of our society is aimed at occupying the brain that way. You see that? That's one of the difficulties, right?
The whole educational system.
What?
The whole educational system, spending years and years there, is just affects the thought to become more rigid.
Yeah, well, it
more
may.
Refined, but more rigid.
Yes, it becomes rigid and also lacks subtlety, therefore.
Universities.
What?
Stops the watchful.
Yeah, but you see, to be watchful, you have to be sensitive to... Being watchful means being sensitive to what is subtle. You see, let us suppose you have an animal which is very sensitive to danger. It can see subtle things which we don't see, right? Or even take the case of people like the Australian Aborigines. They are able to live in the desert where we can't, right? It's clear that they're able to see subtle signs and see the meaning which escape us, right? So our net doesn't pick it up, right? Now they have a net that does pick it up, and of course but they have no way of handling us, you see. That net blows up as soon as it comes in contact with our civilization, right? So there's something wrong with that too, right? But still, it's important to see all these differences, to see. In other words, they don't have the ideal solution either, but you can learn something by looking at them, right? You could say, just think of that, some animal or a person who lives, the Australian Aborigines say they go into a different kind of time. They call it dream time. I'm not clear exactly what it means, but it's evidently a different kind of consciousness which is able to pick up subtleties which we don't, right? Now, of course, they wouldn't pick up some of the subtleties of our culture unless they were trained in it too, you see, but so you can see that the brain has potential for all sorts of things that we're not realizing.
Modern age, that potential is being more and more narrowed down. I mean, these aborigines are disappearing into our brains.
Yeah, there are very few of them left who can do this, you see.
It's becoming quite monolithic.
See, that's one of the troubles of our society. It's swamping the world with sort of, it's like this virus that fills the computer.
Something can be learned, not just from a different group of human beings, but a tree, for example. It has everything it needs to be what it is. Nutrition from the ground, it takes carbon dioxide and oxygen in the air, chlorophyll in the leaves, and it lives for 300 or 400 years. Cold, frost, whatever, there's something there that, well, you can say the Aborigines have lasted for 30,000 years in their civilization, culture, but trees have done whatever for millions of years, and they're in harmony. We're not.
Yeah, well, it's our thought that's not. You see, the point is that our thought, which is our greatest potential, or not our greatest, but a very important potential, right, is not working right, and it's messing up the rest, right? Now, the human body itself is probably a marvel far greater than the tree in some sense, the whole system. But but you see, the more it's organized, the more danger there is of disorganization, right? Now, say that we have to see. It may be now. Also, if we take attention, you can have attention in all kinds of things, all kinds of forms. Right? In principle, it would seem attention could take any form. It's unlimited. Right? You see that, and if attention is unlimited, as well as unlimited subtlety being possible, then it would seem maybe that's the way toward the unlimited. Now, and maybe that's the action of the unlimited. Maybe you see that something gets picked up in attention, awareness, attention. And then you see attention becomes intention. Now, you see, and then comes the other way, right, as action. Right? So intention gives rise to action. And the point is that without attention, your intention is not free. You see, you cannot form an intention to that to which you cannot pay attention. Right? If it's not there, well, how can you have any intention to it, you see? So, therefore...
You say you could form inappropriate intention.
Well, only
if you're
because...
not paying attention.
But you're not attending to it. You see, I'm trying to say then that if you're forming an intention that's inappropriate...
You're not having there's no attention.
There's not the right attention, and therefore not the right intention, right? You see, so the point now is that many of our intentions may be formed from the thought, right? And in many cases that's good enough. But when we come to these more subtle questions, we cannot rely on thought to form our intentions, right? Right? Now, because that is too limited and fixed, right? You see that suppose we would think of having an intention to explore to the unlimited, right? But if our attention is limited, it has no meaning. You see, so therefore, the limits of intention are the same as the limits of attention. Now will really is a kind of intention. You see, it's a kind of focused intention. Another word for will is determination. You see that the intention becomes determinate and focused. Right? Now, people talk about free will, but see, that gets the wrong end of the stick, because it's only the freedom of attention which can bring about the freedom of intention. If your attention is limited, then free will must be a pure illusion, right? You see, so therefore, that's another bit of thought of type B which has gone wrong. You see, implicit thought of type B. That is thought about will, right? Which is part of thought. And so you see, the will depends on thought usually, and the content of the will depends on what you think is necessary, right, and good or whatever. And so you see, it doesn't mean anything to say I resolve to to be more subtle. Right? Or I will to be more subtle. Because there are all sorts of things. It's like this computer filled with the virus. See, the only way they could clean it up was to be sensitive to it, find out what it was, right, in the program. But otherwise, it would mean putting a counter program on top to try to control the first one, and that wouldn't work, right? So therefore, the point now is that freedom can only be from the unlimited. You see, only the unlimited could be free. Anything limited is thereby not free, right? It is compelled to stay within those limits. So therefore, freedom must be from the unlimited. And only insofar as there is this contact with the unlimited could there be freedom. As long as we operate mechanically, we are not free. You see, though we may have the impression we are, or belief that we are, right?
Freedom of choice is really freedom within the limited.
Yes, and it's not really freedom. You see, the major point is that you're presented with certain possibilities in order to make a choice. That depends on your thought, right? What you think is possible. Now, if that thought is not free, then you may say, I must choose between A, B, C, D, but that itself is not free. Maybe you should choose something entirely different outside that framework altogether, right? You see,
there is a stage of alertness where there is no choice. Where all the negative chemicals just stand still and do not work. In absolute alertness. There is an intelligence which can possibly reach the unlimited.
Yes, possibly. You say, saying that the point is now that as long as this brain is following its own internal goals, then it will be occupied, right? You see, now that's necessary in certain contexts. But if we consider that it's also necessary to reach the unlimited or contact it, then there must be a period of silence. There must be a silence, a lack of occupation. Right? Now that connects with the question of goals and time. You see that. Or perhaps we'll come to that a little later. But anyway, is that clear that
I don't understand what the freedom is from, and I'll just say why might hear my misunderstanding. If there is attention, and there's a certain unlimited, well, I don't know what words to use. There's no choice. The attention that comes from that attention. I don't think there's any choice in the matter.
No.
So that there isn't freedom of choice, but there may be freedom from the literal thought or something.
Yeah, it's freedom from that literal thought, which is so creates such suffering, right? And but also there's a positive sense of freedom, which is creativity, that the unlimited limits itself to make a form, right? See, that's the way an artist could be looked at, of saying that from the potential of the unlimited, a form comes. But if his forms are limited, you say he knows certain techniques and certain forms, and he's imitating the forms of other artists, then it wouldn't be creative, right?
There's no such thing as freedom of choice, but there is choiceless freedom.
Yeah, well, it could be. You see, it's hard to say that their choice is involved in freedom, but it can't be the basic point. You see that the basic point is this creativity. You see, if you're not creative, then it's whatever you choose is not going to make any difference. You see, no, not at this depth. You see that. So, therefore, it ties together with the question of creativity, right?
How does this relate to the question of method? Having a method to achieve this.
Well, that could be. That comes to the question of time. Yes, where would the method come from? You see, if it comes from the representations and so on, then it's going to be a barrier. Now you see, an artist may develop a technique, but if he copies somebody's technique, that's wrong, right? That is, he learns the technique creatively learns the technique along with everything else, right? The technique itself is creatively developed, rather than being imitated, right? You see the difference, that, in other words, the whole act is an act of creativity, including the technique.
Does this make any sense? That all of this that is taking place, no matter where we're located in, is creativity. And so, the creativity is already here.
Well, it's potential, but you see, it's not going to really be working if the mind is occupied with the fixed forms. You see.
Even the lack of creativity, which we may be manifesting, takes place within creativity.
Yes, it's all, the foundation is creativity, but the ground, right?
We can understand the comment that Picasso said that the greatest creative painter he ever met was an Aborigine, 90 years old, at some rock or something in Australia. That when he met him, he said he was the greatest creative painter he had ever seen. He had no method, no whatever. He did primitive art.
Yes, I think also some of the Aborigines paint on sand or draw on sand and so on. They're not trying to make anything permanent, you see. What?
Nothing for the gallery.
Well, they do it really just to be creative, you see.
Thought is the thought is of the past, and creativity is of, we'll say, the future. You're getting something new. And you can't think yourself into something new. I don't think so.
I don't think it's the future. I think creativity is now.
Yeah.
Rather than the future or the past. Or maybe the past has some indirect influence on it. But
see, the creativity is always here, but the realization of it may be lacking.
Yes, the full realization that, you see, yeah, you see, you could say that in some sense, in these earlier times, people lived a more pervasively creative life on the whole, that even to be living in nature does not involve repetitiousness nearly as much as our life, that if they lived as hunter-gatherers, it's a much more varied, so you can't make a repetitive pattern out of it, you see. Now, once you established agriculture and cities and so on, there were advantages to that, but it also created a repetitive pattern that you had to carry out, and you had to hold to it, right? Now, that limited you, see, that was a limitation. Now, it had advantages, but it was a limitation. Psychologically, it created a difficulty. And people got bored with it, you see. Then they began, some people say, in early times, I mean, war was often a means of avoiding boredom, you see. Because, well, it wasn't dangerous, you see. With the limited weapons they had, people were rarely killed, or even, and they may have been hurt, but it was a great adventure with comradeship and so on. You see, they built up to it, and they sort of, the point is that they got that sense of participation.
Test their own endurance.
What?
They could also test their own endurance.
Yes, all sorts of things came out of it. You see that they now, but as weapons got more and more dangerous, and as the thing got more organized, it became really. Finally, we got even the American Civil War. General Sherman said, "War is hell." You see, and after that, it got worse still. So
stop thought with thought, because that's just more activity of thought. And also watching it and noticing this whole process seems to alter it or make it more flexible, but it still doesn't stop it.
Yeah, so we should consider, we can't stop it, because that would be the same thing, wouldn't it? You see, so it's a question, you see, the first thing is sensitivity, subtlety, attention, right?
Well, this attention seems to have a different quality from awareness. Well, if the attention isn't there, what would bring about this attention? It seems to be the big
yes,
thing
well,
here.
it's natural in a sense. Something is stopping it now, you see.
That's what I want to know.
What's stopping it is the whole system of representations which say there's nothing to attend to. You see, people are very ready to attend to whatever they think is worth attending to. I mean, for example, people will attend to, give endless attention to making money, right? Now, so that's because the representations make it clear that, make it that making money is important and has high priority and so on. They're not making it clear that this thing has high priority.
The question of well-being, that we're constantly looking for well-being, whatever's meant by that term. And so if I'm constantly after money, it's implied that somehow through that, then I will be all right.
Yes, or if we go back to some people do it that for well-being, some people do it to expand the ego, so they feel something is missing, and if they had money, the ego would be more complete, right? People would have a higher esteem for the self.
I think that would be the same thing.
Yeah, so therefore, there's endless amounts of energy and attention, and it can go on for year after year, right?
So, if there is such a thing as well-being, it's something that's already present.
Well, it's not active. You see, let's say it's a potential. Right?
Yeah, but if I'm looking for money, or looking in this discussion to find the answer, whatever I'm looking for, that movement, this is the attention. My attention is in that movement of becoming all right. If I get the notion that their all rightness, if there is such a thing, it must be something I already have.
That's still part of representation.
Yeah, but you see, the trouble, then somebody will ask you, if you already have it, why doesn't it show it? Why isn't it visible? You say, well, to you, right?
It is.
Well, maybe if so, then you have no problem. But I'm saying that there's so many people who feel it's not all right.
See, they're engaged in that movement. Right?
What?
I'm engaged in that movement, say, of becoming all right. I may be here at this meeting with you trying to become all right.
Yeah, well then that becoming, that's what Krishnamurti would talk about. Becoming is a wrong process again, because there's no way to become, because there's no time to change this. You already are, whatever is happening, it's already there in the memory, so that the confusion is already there. And also, if anything is going to come right, it's not going to come, it's already potentially there anyway. It's a matter of not interfering with it, right?
It seems like becoming is a limiting process. And if you say becoming, it seems like you've already decided what you want to become.
Yes. You see, psychologically it doesn't seem to be relevant, but we were saying that thought uses this approach, which it applies technically, and it slips over, remember, it seems natural that people should apply it in this context. You see, you can see why, because it's literal thought, which took the object and said, we have an object, and if it's not right, if it's incomplete, we can make it, do something with it, make it become more complete, right? We form a goal or purpose, which takes time. We have an end, and we have the means to achieve the end. Huh? Now then gradually that gets applied to the human being and to the psyche and everything, because it's always spreading, literal thought. And you then say, me as an object is incomplete, right? But I as the subject, feel I ought to be complete, and I'm identified subject and object, remember? And therefore, there must be an effort to make me complete. So just as I would do in any technical or practical job, I project what I want as complete, and I find that's the end, and I find the means, and I try to do it, which takes time, right?
That's what leads into today is yesterday, and tomorrow will still be yesterday. It's the same.
Yes, well, you see, it doesn't work when applied to this context, right? Now, it doesn't, because this context is too subtle, right?
Saying the vehicle that's being used is not subtle enough for the task.
Yes, and it also has some wrong assumptions about the situation, you see, namely that it doesn't notice that the problem is being created by the very thought which is trying to solve the problem, you see.
So becoming implies choice too, doesn't it?
Well, you choose this goal instead of that, and then you have to ask, where did the choice come from? What made you choose this? But the very distortion of thought that you want to change made you choose this. Therefore your choice is distorted, right? So you have no time to correct it, because by the time you are conscious of this thing, it's already wrong. You see? If you remember what was done by Eccles, when a person became conscious of an intention, but before that, an electrical activity was seen in the brain for a short time, which then came out in consciousness of intention. But the intention was there before he's conscious of it, and that's where we are, you see. So by the time we're conscious of the intention, it's already worked. If it's a twisted intention, it's already worked. There is no time to do it, you see.
Let's see, this indicates that if we're, thought won't do it, becoming won't do it, and all the rest of the things that we've been talking about won't, then it looks like we're going to have to empty the head and attend to what's left.
Well,
then that if I can be aware, this room and different things, but it seems like the I can't be attending.
Yes.
There's just attention, so that seems
that's right.
to
That's something we ought to discuss.
That's
you see,
what I'd really
yeah.
like to
You see,
go
maybe this would be a point. I'll just focus the question, and then we'll have a little break. And you see, the question is this: that we say I must be attentive, but what is I? Right? You see, we've already seen good reason to suspect that it's not such a highly integrated thing. You see, and therefore. What do we mean by I, and what do we mean by something happening without I, if it's got to happen without I, or perhaps whatever. See, the first point is we don't know what the word I really means. We think we know, but we don't, right? And then comes the question of time. Is time appropriate, you see? And so I think, in that question is involved whether time is the right approach, because time is a representation, right?
The less distractions, the more attention there automatically would be.
Yes, but the system is organized to distract itself. You see, that's just like the computer virus. We have put in a program which the computer is programmed to distract itself, so it cannot handle the programs people want it to handle.
So the attention is not a goal.
No, right? No, you can't. You have to give attention to distraction. You see, but attention cannot be a goal. It has to come of its own, right? It will not come through time, right?
Different order than the distraction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's more subtle, and yes, it has to have the energy and passion and subtlety. But I think the first point is to look at what could be meant by the self, and this representation that the self is the source of of everything you do, right? The subject, right? The self is I. I am the one who does everything, right? And me is the one to whom it all happens.
Of extreme alertness, there is no I.
Maybe, you see, we have to be careful about the statement, because it could become just another representation, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we should have our break now. Yes, well, there are several things I'd like to discuss in the remaining time, and we could begin with the question that was raised at the end of the last hour. What can we say about the self, and me, I, and we already said some things, and now I wanted to suggest, what the self is the result of a representation. You see that we represent the world as made of objects, and one of them is me, right? So that's me as an object. I'm in a certain place. See, at a certain point, a child is able to do that, right? And also, the child can say that as I see the other person, he sees me, and so on, so he can begin to see himself as an object, right? By imagining somebody else looking at him. And but you build up a representation that way. But in addition, there's the sense of the subject, which is unlimited, which is sort of more participatory. The object is more literal thought, right? Now, the point is, how does this representation? It produces a presentation of a self. That's what I'm trying to say. There may be a real self for all we know. You see, we mustn't make assumptions what the self is or isn't. But I'm saying that the self that we experience, the phenomenal self, the self that appears in the phenomena, the appearance, is the result of a representation. That is what I'm saying. Whether there's a real self or not, we can only explore. Right? Now, okay, so now the representation of the self includes looking at somebody else and saying, I look the same to him, right? And therefore, you see, a representation contains an image insofar as you imagine it. It presents it inwardly as if it were there. That makes an image, right? The image is not only the way it looks or the way it feels. It's an image of intention, desire, will. It's an image of the whole thing, right? All the memory. It looks very active. You see, it's more like an image produced by an actor who is acting in a role, rather than an image which is just a photograph or a television image. And so there's a kind of internal image, and but then that seems more subtle than the body. And at some stage, when people talk about the child has to attribute his intentions to something and his perceptions or whatever his experiences, so he says it's that thing inside of me, right? Which people later call the soul and so on, and saying that's, and then, it may be to some extent that's a useful representation, but it gets to be taken very literally. In other words, all these things may have had considered as myth or as poetry or something, or as participatory, could have been made sense, but now they got more and more literal about it, saying there is me inside somehow, and this me is the source. I see thoughts taking place and emerging, and actions, and things are happening to me, and so on, and feelings and all that. So in this representation, it all happens to this entity called me, and it's all done by this entity called I, right? Who are both the same, right? Now, now that produces feelings inside. You see, if you say me, if you produce me is good, I am good, it produces that representation contains feelings, which are presented inside in the intestinal region, the solar plexus, the head, or wherever, and you feel that if they're very strong, you say, well, they're real gut feelings and they're straight from the heart, and so on. You see, they say that, in other words, you don't see them being produced that way, and therefore it is, in thinking about them, it is assumed they're independently real and of great significance, right? Because they're very central and so on, you see. And in fact, I said last year there was an instrument called a polygraph, you see it, which attaches an electrode to your finger. It measures some sort of skin resistance. So if your autonomic nervous system is working, it deflects. Now, that means around here, right? And so if somebody says something disturbing to you, about 3 seconds later, the needle deflects, right? Because, why? Because it takes 3 seconds to hit down the spinal column, I suppose. And it's in the pipeline for 3 seconds, and then it works, right? But then, since you don't see it going down the pipeline, they say it worked independently. It was a gut feeling, very important, right? Or straight from the heart, right? You see, now there may be gut feelings straight from the heart, but you see, the representation can produce something very similar, right? So that's where the difficulty is now. And then, in addition, there's thoughts that come out, they're attributed to this center. There's a sense of a center being created by those feelings, right? It may be felt to be here, You say, if somebody says where, they point at themselves, they usually point about here somewhere, right? But they might point here, or anywhere, right? And the feeling sometimes is I'm here, or I'm here, or I'm down here, or up here, somewhere, right? It moves around. That's where the center is. Now, that center, I say, is simply the presentation of the representation, right? But it looks, since we don't see this happening, it looks as if it's just there. And therefore, when we think about it, we treat it as being just there, and that helps to build it up some more, right? Because it makes a stronger representation and a stronger presentation. And then the more people talk about it, then you say, not only do I say so, but they all say so. It must be so. And therefore it gets stronger and stronger, right? And so you do depend on other people to provide the self-image. You see, that's why people get disturbed when something bad is said about the self. You see, it's being represented in another way and therefore presented in an unpleasant way, and you feel bad, right? In a very central place. So therefore you can see it building up, this self, right? It's a phenomenon. It appears. It's like a show, right? A show means something appears, but it doesn't mean there's anything behind it, right? It may or may not be. Something real may show, or something may not. It may just be a show. So now, but the self is clearly a phenomenon. It exists. It has power. See, things happen according to the self. If there is a desire built into this, something will happen, right? If there is fear, something will happen, you see. Desire arises when, say, there may be a natural animal appetite, but when when the self is image, when the representation is sensed as incomplete, there's sensed a need for something more to complete it, right? The word desire has a Latin root, desideratum, meaning what is needed, right? Therefore, the sense of something needed is there in a central place, in the gut feeling and so on, or wherever. It may be longing, yearning. I say the four words: longing, yearning, hankering, and what was another one? Craving, right? In the dictionary. That gives a notion of what is meant by desire. Now, it's really all experienced here in this center of the self, as if we're there. You see, remember the illustration I gave last year. You have a television set, a bell is ringing. Now you don't know where it's coming from, but if you may attribute it to the image of the bell in the television set, so you experience it coming from there. You see, it's presented as if coming from there. It's the show. Then, if nobody gets up in the image to answer the phone, you may begin to wonder, it may be your own phone in the next room, right? You see, if they all go on ignoring that telephone. So but if somebody gets up to answer it in the image, then you don't worry, you see. So the point is, the way it's shown, the way it is presented. You see, a show is a presentation, and the way it is presented is according to the whole representation. And the self, therefore, gets built up that way, right? This phenomenal self, which has all sorts of activities which can flow from it, because according to this presentation or show, everything happens, right? According to the way consciousness produces the show, everything must happen. You see, the show of the immediate. So that show is constantly being produced. Now, affected by the past. Right? But it's really not the past, because the past is gone. Right? It's the past as active in the present, through memory. See, just as you may look at a video of what happened in the past, but you're not looking at the past. You're looking at the present, right? The present activity of the video set, based on the tape, which is present. So but it contains something which, in some sense, recreates the past, right? Now, the appearance of the past, or the show of the past, or the presentation. So, therefore, you have this self, right? Now, then everything is attributed to the self. Intention, will, desire, everything. But the self is very dubious. Beyond being a phenomenon, is it anything behind it? Beyond the fact that there's a big stir going on around it.
Self is an explicit order, that takes itself as the implicit order.
Well, but it also may be something implicit. All sorts of implicit thoughts are in there too, you see. It's both, you see. But the point is, it does not have an independent reality like presumably this has. You see, that this will be what it is whether we think of it or not, more or less anyway. But this self depends on thought, but it is not noticed that that is the case, right? That the thought produces a representation. We do not see that becoming the presentation, and that will require sensitivity, awareness, attentiveness, alertness, whatever word we have, right? All these words convey something of what is needed. To see that this is not the way it appears. See, in order to see that the sound is not coming from your telephone or is not coming from the image, you need to be a little more alert, right? In other words, you're not just immersed in the program, but you begin to raising questions of type B, you see, about the program.
The self is something, but it's not what it represents itself to be.
Yes, but it's something very insubstantial and very not terribly significant, right? That
expresses itself through this body. We tend to substantiate it in that way.
Yes, it obtains apparent substantiality because everything the body does is directed by this show. And it seems to be coming from the show, and it's represented as coming from the show and presented as coming from the show. Just like the television. In the television set, the sound is presented as coming from that bell, but there's no bell in there, there's nothing in there at all, there's just spots of light, right? It can't be coming from there. It's coming from the speaker, you see, or else it's coming from your own telephone in the next room, right?
Really, we're not there.
What?
Really, we're not there. There's no such thing as self.
Well, not the self, the phenomenal self. We don't know whether there's a self or not, but this phenomenal self is a show, that's what I'm saying. Whether there's anything behind it or not, well, that we have to inquire into. But, you see, so most of what we call the self is a show with nothing behind it, except thought, we see, except representations.
But doesn't it start from childhood to identify myself as my body? So
yes.
A physical body, a different physical body.
Yeah, but that's thought which identifies, you see. It's thought which says I am the same as my body, you see. But you see, it's the same as to say the sound is coming from the telephone in the image, right? It looks very real, right? You see that you can feel now it's coming from inside, with a little bit of thought you can just it's presented that the self is in there, right? You see, and that the self is identical with the body and also something more than the body and so on.
We can have a feeling, if we notice, that I exist, I am, a real firm feeling of being, and then the I identifies with this and says, I am, I exist, and I think that's what gives the I this strong feeling of identification, even though the experience of being doesn't have an I attached to it necessarily.
Or it may be that all this goes on without that, but see, the words I am, I think, therefore I am, will be a representation saying my essential being is thinking, right? And I'll experience it that way. Or I could say I feel, therefore I am, or I do, therefore I act, therefore I am. Or I possess something, therefore I am, some people think, because of what I possess. If I didn't possess anything, I'd be nothing, right? And many people feel they've lost their identity when they've lost their possessions, right? It's all thought, clearly, because if it were anything real, it would never go, right? Identity is supposed to be the same forever. That's the whole context. The whole meaning of the word identity, always the same.
People who identify themselves with the money, they get such a strong shock watching the stock exchange results. What happened to the shares the next day?
Because it's the very self, you see, that's attacked, right?
Last year you mentioned something about the necessity for the organism to organize its sensations around a particular place, which helped me understand that could be like the kernel, the natural kernel for this self to start organizing. There's this feeling of...
it's all organized around some sort of center, and there's a body image, for example, which is built in. And see, for example, if somebody loses an arm, he still feels he's got it for quite a while because it's built into the way the nerves work, right? And therefore we organize all sorts of kind of image of a center around which we organize our activities. That, however, begins to be taken literally and builds up, you see.
Get some kind of feeling of identity
Yeah.
beyond.
So once it's taken literally, it becomes an image that is worshipped, right?
I've seen some women who've had breast surgery, and it isn't the surgery, they do fine and it's healed, but it's psychologically that the fact of losing a breast has had a terrific shock on the rest of their life. They're not able to sort of that becomes themselves.
It's the same thing no matter what you lose. You see that if it's part of you, an essential part of you, then it will be a great shock to lose it. Now, so somebody who, to one person it may identify with something else, and it would not be a shock. You see, so the point is that this self then is a phenomenon, but it takes on central importance and it rules everything, right? It takes on the supreme value. It's the first priority, right? Because of its place and its importance that is attributed to it. Because in the representation, right? And now also you identify with your country, and even the body goes. You see, even the body can be sacrificed, right? See, so you could identify in all sorts of ways. It all goes according to how you think, right? Now, and that's the point of all these people teaching these children all these songs and ceremonies and so on. This is very powerful, and it's built into the society and to each person, you see. So it will not, apparently not easily changed, but it doesn't mean that it will never change, right? You see, it's a very powerful thing, but we've got to look at it. We've got to begin, to see it, right? Now, this self is tied very much to the question of time. You see. Now, this is very crucial, you see. Time, I say time is a form of thought. You see, what time is a representation of successive order and movement and process, right? We observe movement and process, perceive it, and we represent it as time. As a line. For example, the mathematician may draw a line and call it t, right? Really, he uses space to represent time, right? You see, space can represent time, and then time can represent space, right? So now, of course, but that line is an abstraction. It's just a representation, right? You take a certain point on that line and say that's now, right? But it's only a representation. You see, so, but let's think of now. You see, now, at this moment now, the past is gone, and the future is not yet. It doesn't exist either. But if this point and the line divides one side of the line from the other, you see, it divides the past from the future. So it divides what doesn't exist from what doesn't exist. So it also doesn't exist. You see, so you can see that there's something wrong with that, taking that representation too seriously. You see, we have to notice it is only a representation.
You're saying that time comes in the movement of thought between the categories. There's a movement of process in there which involves time. Is that
when I would say that there's a movement of process which we are aware of, right? And we then, in order to think about it, we have produced the concept of time, right? Just as the concept of water brought together for Helen Keller all sorts of examples of water. So the concept of time brings order to this whole process, enables us to think about it and to make plans and so on in an orderly way, right? Now, but we have to be careful because this, once again, this has been taken too literally, and we have come to the conclusion that everything exists in time. They say, at this point in time, we... saying as if time were all there and we're at a certain point in it on that line, you see. But it wouldn't make sense to think time is such a line. Are you
saying that time is an abstraction from movement?
Yeah.
Does that imply that time itself doesn't exist?
Well, does the map exist? A map exists, but what it is a map, right? What time is a thought.
We can only live in the instant now. We can't live in the past second or the next 5 seconds until it gets there. But in our thinking, we're doing that. forward and back.
Well, we suppose we're doing it. You see that we can't. The point is now that the past is gone, the future is not yet. Now is the immediate, right? And thought mediates because thought comes in between, and then thought once as it makes a representation, and it becomes part of the next immediate. You see, is that clear? That but thought also is present now, right? It is not the past really. It's just a poetic way of talking to say the past is affecting us. Only the present can affect us. We mustn't take it too literally. You see, this poetic kind of thought or metaphorical or may be taken too literally. Now, it's a representation, right? And time is a representation. But now notice the danger in that. You see, that representation produced tremendous results. In early times, in primitive times, time was hardly noticed, you see. People had a vague notion of tomorrow, and the past was mostly mythological, right? They didn't have any history. They weren't capable of writing it down even. They had some sort of stories that were carried along. But they were mostly mythology, you see. Then now the future and the past were almost interchangeable, you see, because they were thought of as cyclical. And in fact, in the Hebrew language, or probably others, the future and the past are almost the same tense. Some minor modification of one makes the other. So the point then is, now we began to use time more, and we ordered our actions by time, saying we've got to do things at a certain time, we meet at a certain time. By doing that, we can cooperate more effectively, right? You see, if we have to run a big enterprise and everybody goes according to his own time when time is ripe for him, it won't work, right? Everybody's got to get together and make a common time, right? And therefore we abstract that notion and make a representation of it, and our clocks measure it and so on. And we begin to take it more and more seriously, literally, and we begin to feel time exists. You see, time is money. Time is of the essence.
William Blake who said something about
chronological time.
Yeah, that's chronological time. Yeah.
William Blake who said, there's a line that goes, it's famous, it's the best laid plans of mice and man. But the next two lines, which people don't usually know, he said, but little mouse, you're more lucky than me because all you see is the present, whereas I have the past and future. Is that?
That was Robert Burns.
Robert Burns.
Yeah. Yes. The point is that we project the future from the knowledge of the past, but we don't know the future at all. We can predict the weather roughly or do various things like that, but we don't know much about the future, and it comes for reasons that are perhaps ultimately from the unlimited, right? And but to a certain extent we can predict it. Now, but it's always open to contingency, and it never happens exactly the way we hope. And the point then is that time, now notice the key point, you see. The key point is this, that time is a representation, an abstract representation, but it becomes a presentation. And therefore, we can feel the reality of time.
Gives it the feeling of reality.
Yeah. And then that time, however, is the self is represented as existing in time. It cannot be represented otherwise. It's an object which exists in time. Any object has to be represented that way. If it flashed in and out of existence, you would hardly call it an object. It would be anything, right? It would not be an object, right? And therefore, you see, you have to have a history and a future. You see, the child must try to go back and think of his identity. The identity consists of being the same person over time, right? If you're not, suppose you were one person today and another person tomorrow, your body might be the same, but you wouldn't be satisfied, you see. You've got to be the same person all the way through, right? No, but I mean, that's the concept of identity, right?
Change.
But I meant the concept of identity, which is common, is that's what it means, right? You've got to be the same person all the way through, and therefore, but if you die, what does that mean? So you can project it forward, or you can project it back before birth, and so on. You see, if you can't do that, you can't maintain identity. Because it's not a true identity if it comes into being and goes out, you see. So therefore, the self and time are really inseparable concepts. The self is object, the self is identical. And the self, but then comes the discovery that the self is incomplete, right? It's an object which is incomplete, and also, but I should be complete, and therefore the projection in time of completing it, right? You see, that that's becoming, right? You see, now that's the wrong use of becoming, right? So, because that there isn't anything there to become, you see. See, if you say this becomes that, well, okay, a seed becomes a tree, right? But that's a correct representation. But the self-becoming cannot be a correct representation. Any more than you would say that the image in the television set becomes anything. You see, it looks as if it's becoming. It has a phenomenon of becoming, a show of becoming. But actually, that's just a series of images, slightly different, right? So you see, suppose you say, I see a picture of a seed becoming a plant, you see, shown in television. So it looks as if one is just constantly an identity, but there is no identity there, right? You see that the image never becomes anything. It's just being produced all the time from the source, right? That may have a show of becoming. The phenomenon is becoming, right? You see, so now the suggestion is the self is of that nature. You see that insofar as there is a true self, that would be its nature. Now that there is succession in time, but or if we want to put it that way, you see succession in process, but it's identity is just similarity with difference, right? Just as in the case of the television images that succeed each other. If they were too different, you wouldn't think there was any identity at all. But if they're too similar, it's just static. You know, it doesn't mean anything. So there has to be a movement with constant preservation of identity, right? And this, however, is only a phenomenon or a show, right? That's the suggestion. Now, but since if it did exist in the form it appears to have, it would be very significant. It would be very central. Right? Therefore, the whole being watches this show and acts accordingly. The whole being acts according to the show. Right? Now, that would be the suggestion then that the self is of that nature. Now, we mustn't accept this or reject it. It's a suggestion to be explored. Right? I think it explains a lot of things, you see, which were very strange in the other way of looking at it, right? Of saying there is a self with identity and all that. The self behaves in such a strange way that it's a belief that you have the right explanation, when you assume that. Now, therefore, we could explore that, but that would require sensitivity, you know, it require just this attentiveness without restriction. See, ordinary attentiveness is restricted by the representations. The sensitivity is restricted, the alertness is restricted. But when, if there may be a sensitivity to how this is happening, which will begin to dissolve the restriction.
What the human being has done, taken the abstraction and formed a concept, calling it time, because there is an explicit order of earth in our own life, but in reality, in a deeper way, there may be not any such thing as time at all in the universe.
Yeah, well, there is and there isn't, in the sense that this object is here, but really it's the unlimited, right? It's both here and not here, right? There is, in some sense, time is a correct abstraction, it is a correct representation.
You could look, maybe, if you could, say, 500 years from now at the Amazon forest, if suppose man doesn't destroy the earth, well, if you flew over it and looked at it, it would look the same birds and insects, supposedly. You could look at the universe in the same way and see the stars and the galaxies, and maybe, well, it's just the stars of evolution, the stars, birth and death, but it's still the same overall picture. And as far as the universe is concerned, maybe there's no such thing as time. It just is.
Yes, well, we could say that it just is, and you see that there is, in a sense, time in the sense that if we use this abstraction, we will get a correct description for certain purposes, right? So the unlimited is of such a nature that it will allow itself to be described correctly for certain purposes that way. But now when it comes to the self, that is not a correct description, you see, not a good representation. And that's the suggestion. Now, Therefore, the self may perhaps have to act timelessly, moment to moment, you see, or say the being, right? And that the right action is moment to moment, you see, that the attempt to project the future inwardly is wrong, you see, is inappropriate, and that from the unlimited, the intelligence acts moment to moment, you see. But the attempt to make it act in this order of time then sort of fills the brain with all this occupation, which prevents the other thing from coming in, right?
So you're then suggesting that there is a creation that is discontinuous.
Well, it's neither even discontinuous is too definite a term. You see, if we say moment to moment, that in some sense you could say that the differences of moments are due to the past. You see, the basic structure of each moment is similar to anyone, right? But the differences are more on the surface, right? And now, well, the basic nature of each moment is similar. You see, each moment is the present now, right? There are differences of content within that present, within perception and thought, right? But the whole basic process is always similar. Now, insofar as you abstract away from detailed content, it gets more and more similar, right? So if you could say, get free of all the content, then time would go, right? I mean, perhaps the mind would be operating in another order, right?
Movement would go?
No, I don't know. I mean, maybe there could be kind of movement, but not movement as represented by time.
Are there two kinds of movement?
There may be, you see. That there may be a more subtle movement.
Creativity?
Yeah.
More complete, more continuous.
Yeah.
How can it be called movement?
Well, we have to call it something. You see, the point is that time is an abstraction from movement. We say movement is succession of some kind, but there's a particular kind of order which we call time, you see. Now, there may be a very much more subtle order, which we cannot describe. Our language is not up to it, right?
And movement as we know it and time are synonymous?
They could be, but we don't have to make them that way. You see, words are to a certain extent, their meaning can be determined by in a new way, right?
So you asking about physical movement, or what kind of, can we define this movement you're asking about?
Movement. It's just used a word. That's, you have to use some word.
Yeah, you see, there is movement from here to there. You see, that's just simply mechanical movement, right? Now, but we also use movement in a more subtle sense. You see, like the movement of a symphony, right? Now, that's not moving from here to there. You could think of an orchestra on a train. This would have the movement of the symphony mechanically. But you don't mean that. No, but it's, yeah, the difference between taking time and time being of the essence. You see, in the ordinary level, time is not only taken as a succession, but time is of the essence of what it is. You see, people even say time is of the essence, right? You see, time is the true being, it means. Now, here we're saying, it's in the case of the television image, you see an object moving across the screen, right? I mean, no object is moving across the screen. It's being created all the time. The appearance is being created all the time by electrons striking the screen.
Is it sort of an unmovable move, like it's not static?
Well, it's hard, you know.
It's movement, but it's unmovable. Yes.
It's not moving mechanically, you see.
Right.
You see that there's a movement of meaning, for example, you see it, which
moving from here to there.
A movement from here to there is mechanical, right? But in the case of communication, a movement of meaning, and in music, there's a movement of meaning, right? But we call it a movement, right? Now that's using the word more poetically, right? Or less literally.
Can we call the movement of energy?
Well, we may say energy and movement, yes.
Of music?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a matter of using the language more freely, you see, not less literally.
literally becomes like synonymous to restriction.
What?
Literally becomes synonymous to restricted.
What?
We can say literally.
That's true. Yes, literal meaning is strict, you see. Now, if the meaning is not literal, then it's freer. Now, one of the forms of non-literal meaning is poetic metaphor, you see, but the other form is, we've talked about participation, so we'll have to come back to that. You see that? But to come back here, that movement, we are using the language more freely, less literally, to try to explore something different. Now, people have used it already, right? They've said there's a movement of a symphony, there's a political movement, right? They don't mean you're moving from here to there, right? It's a kind of meaning again, right?
Change. And then what is it?
What?
There's a shifting, and then the question is, what is shifting?
But that's a question you ask because of literal thought. That if something shifts, something, if there's a shifting, something must shift. But you see, I mean, the image shifts in, there's an automobile crossing the screen, you see. So what is it that crosses the screen? You see, nothing.
There's an appearance of movement in your brain when you imagine something.
Yeah, there may be an appearance of mechanical movement, right?
There isn't any real movement on that level.
But attention moves, you see. Attentiveness moves. Capturing all sorts of attentiveness may move very fast, right? But it's not a movement from here to there.
Movement of understanding, when you don't understand something and all of a sudden you do understand it, kind of, which is no movement physically to speak of.
Yeah, well, it's not a mechanical movement. It's, you see, movement from one place to another is a certain kind of movement, and we may make it too literal, right?
Action. Could you use the word action?
Yeah, well, action is also so, but a movement conveys a little bit more in the sense of some sort of order, right? Not necessarily. You see, we're trying to say that action may not imply time, you see. There may be action in the moment, right? And in fact, that may be the complete action, right? You see, now, I think that before we should return to this question of participatory thinking. You see that as long as we stick to this literal thought, then there's no room in it for this participation. Right? We think only of external mechanical relationships. We think movement is mechanical, and we think the self is there, so on. Right? Everything comes from the self. Now, in the participation, we have the unlimited as the ground of everything, and the thought is a representation, a presentation. It is not taken to be the true being, right? Now, the true being is the unlimited. Now, but the thought may establish distinctions and so on, but between those distinctions there is participation, right? Between people or between anything and anything, between thought and feeling. I will say ultimately it's the nature of all the world that it's all mutual participation. Everything is everything, you see. And the point now is that the change of representation is what makes possible this participation. You see, the people who lived according to the participatory thought may have experienced a world that is different from the one we experience. Like they take the Aborigines' dream time, they must be experiencing a world in a different way, right? And so they're sensitive to different things and so on, which we don't see. Now, we're not attentive to it. And the earlier peoples were attentive to a world which was participatory, where everything was part of everything, right? There may have been, I've said it wasn't an ideal world, there were many troubles with that kind of thinking, but still that would just notice what it is. Now, then came the literal thinking, which had many advantages and many disadvantages. And now, what are we going to do, you see? We don't want to give up literal thinking altogether, but we don't want to make it dominant, you see, as we've done. It's not right to make it dominant. It has its place.
So, participatory thinking should be dominant?
The major thing. You see that in human relationships, in the mind, or in it is really dominant, but we have to at least acknowledge that it is, right? You see, now, so one of the points of all we've been saying is that it helps to, getting rid of this literal thinking helps to open up and loosen the whole thing so that participatory action becomes possible. Otherwise it's impossible.
Is what has created all this violence and war.
Yeah.
And participatory thinking is what makes us be able to relate to each other.
Yes, but we also need the literal thinking and the correct and so on in its place. Yes, you see it, and also even it makes the participation far better. Right? But the, for example, as I said, in a primitive way, participatory thinking led in some cases to cannibalism, saying we participate in you by eating you. Right? In other words, I partake of you and. And therefore I absorb your virtues. That literally was what they said, right? You see, now, we don't believe that cannibalism is really right, you see, that it all happens that way, you see, that you could go wrong there, you see. This literal, relatively literal thinking can help to show it up, right? It can help us there, but we use some more literal thinking to show that can't make sense, right? But nevertheless, the basic, the major point is got to be the participatory thinking. If people can't really communicate and get together and listen to each other, then nothing is going to work, right? The more we develop technology, the more dangerous it's going to get. So the more dangerous literal thinking gets, right? So therefore we have got, you see, to be able to see, the difficulty is that people cannot listen to each other. Each one has his own opinion, his own there are a lot of differences of representations. He sees the world presented to him differently. Therefore, he sees a different world, you see, and that's why they're not agreeing. You see, they're acting as if, really, we see the same world, but we just have to call attention to a few points so that we can agree, right? But in fact, in some sense, people are seeing different worlds. You see, the people in two different nations are seeing reality in what they call in a different way, and each one is convinced he's seeing the reality, and the other one can't understand what they're doing, right? And they can say they're deceiving themselves, they're deceiving us. But now, so we need to be sensitive to that. And see, one of the points is to suspend our opinions, to suspend the action of from the representation or the presentation, to suspend the commitment to it, and to suspend the belief in it, right? And therefore, if we could manage to do that, you'll find that it's very difficult because there is this tremendous pressure to act that way, right? According to the way it's presented. So I'm saying that actually you do not need to act according to the presentation if you can question it, right? So you're not only we can question the presentation by becoming aware of how it's connected to the representation. So therefore, see, to these Russians, the world is presented in a certain way as if the trouble is coming from outside of Russia, you see, and to the Americans, vice versa. But in fact, the trouble is coming from the whole way this process works. And it has to be suspended, and so we can be sensitive to it, you see. Now, if all of us are suspending this, say in this room, then we are all doing the same thing. We're all looking at everything together, right? We have the content of our consciousness is essentially the same, and therefore, and if we, so that a different kind of consciousness is possible among us, right? A participatory consciousness. It as always is, but one that is frankly acknowledged to be participatory and can go that way. That that everything can move between us. And each person is participating, is partaking of the whole meaning of the group and also taking part in it, you see. We can call it a true dialogue. Now, but that requires, now if we could do that in the context of this unlimited, of acknowledging this unlimited, then we can, we could say the whole group can operate from the unlimited, not just an individual, right? To sort of sum it up, to sort of say that this is the possibility. I mean, we can't, it would take, to do this actually, would take sustained work, right?
Doesn't that seem to bring in time again?
Well, time, I didn't say time has no place, you see. I'm saying time cannot have the dominant place. See, in working, we cannot be appealing to time as the goal to be achieved, the end to be achieved through certain means. What we do takes time, but we are not focusing our attention on time as we do it. You see, it's the same way if the artist were focusing on the goal he's to achieve and saying, when in the world am I going to finish this picture? He wouldn't do very well, right?
For this sustained work to have a possibility, what would you say is required?
Well, just what's required for all of it, you see, to see the importance of it, to see some of the factors that are getting in the way, to be sensitive, and to keep it going in spite of frustration, uncomfortableness, and so on. You see, people, as I've said, have done all sorts of things overcome in spite of frustration, like climbing Mount Everest or making a lot of money or whatever. But here is something I say is more significant, but which requires a similar attitude.
More uncomfortable than climbing Mount Everest.
Well, I don't know. I've never tried Mount Everest.
How do I agree with you? There are more people climbing Mount Everest.
Yes, well, that's becoming an everyday affair almost now, you see. Well, it's just that it may look difficult, but say the whole enterprise, or whatever you want to call it, is worthwhile. That is, it has value. And if we can see that it has value, then we will sustain it. You see, we'll now we have to do it individually in the way we're talking about it, and together, right? So, to establish a mind which is the mind focusing on different things, and we are not seeing the same world, right? We may think we are, but we're not. We're seeing general societies, but at crucial points there are key differences, not in the way we only think about things, but in the way we see things, right? In the world that we see, right? Because that change in that difference in representation makes us see differently. Now, if I see one thing and you see another, there's absolutely no way for us to get together. It's only the only way people could work together is we both see the same thing at the same time. We meet there and seeing that thing, right? And therefore we can see what to do, right? But if I think it's one thing, you think it's another, we're going to be at cross purposes. Now, the point then is, it is possible, according to this, that we become aware of the role of collective representations, which are all somewhat different. Every one of us has a somewhat different version of them, right? To affect how we are seeing things, affect our consciousness. And if we're all doing this, then we all have one consciousness, right? Even though it's not like the beer cellar in Munich, where everybody is sort of overwhelmed by this singing and drinking beer and so on, and jollity and comradeship and all that. But you see, by doing this, we could get a sense of fellowship. It can be impersonal. We don't have to know each other that well. The word fellowship also means participation, you see. That's exactly its meaning. And it becomes friendship, you see. So the point is there's a change in the whole relationship, in the emotional tone, and also it opens up our intelligence, because the blocks to intelligence are going when we see these things, right?
You see it yourself, it makes you have a compassion for someone else, because you know sort of where they're coming from. It makes you feel warm or understanding or patient or affectionate to that person. You don't. Yes, we see the thoughts of everybody, including ourselves, and we see we're not committed to any of them, because the right action may be none of them, right? It may come out creatively.
Now, that means a simultaneous change of thought, thinking, and feeling, you see, or feeling and thinking. You see that it has to be two sides together, you see, otherwise it's not going to work. Right? And people in a large group are generally very afraid of each other and hostile and on edge. They don't know what's going to happen. They're constantly frustrated by the outrageous opinions of the others, or they're afraid they're going to be jumped on because others will think their opinions are outrageous. And there is really not any real contact. Right? Everybody is seeing the world differently. And you see, it's very hard in any group of appreciable size for people to get together. They may, and you see people get together generally for two reasons. One is for entertainment, or the other is to get a useful job done, right? But see, we're saying, no, here's something else, which is an empty space where meaning can be shared. We participate in a common meaning, right? And we create thereby something new.
This group has done that. I've never been in a meeting or seminar with 50 people. Over 3 days, there hasn't been one disagreement or one conflict between.
I think that's very good. But there would be. I think if we kept it up week after week, we would find some frustration. You see, and that would be good because if we would stay, two attitudes to frustration. One is that there's no point to all this. I'll just leave. The other is we'll stay with it and work through it, right? And if we did that, then we would find a communion at a deeper level.
Not this year, maybe, but next or the year after.
What?
Not this year, maybe, but next or the year after.
Oh, like there's the prayer in the Hebrew ceremony next year in Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem, or whatever.
I would personally say that I don't think we can bring time when it happens.
What?
When that communion happens, it just happens beyond measurement of time.
No, I think it happens, and it's neither it's neither an instant nor is it a period, but it's something in which time doesn't count. You see, and see, there is something is perhaps happening, but it's not the main point. You see, the flow of time is not the key point at all. And you may notice, say for example, you may be hardly aware of it. And see, because when we represent time as the key point of saying time is of the essence, time we exist in time, then we're intensely aware of time, you see, and we're intensely feeling time. It's real. We exist in time. We've got to worry about the future and the past and all that. Now, in this other way, then, since the representation is different, the presentation is different, right? The main point is we've dissolved all those old representations, and therefore the thing is free to go in another way.
When you introduce time, or when the mind works on time, that also gives the possibility for despair and failure. You'd hear about people saying, well, I've been trying and trying and it hasn't worked. What they're really saying is the time, they've added time to it. If there wasn't any time, they wouldn't know.
Yeah. You see, that's true.
Recipe for failure and all those things to bring time in there in some ways.
Yes, it's an appeal to time. You see, if we say time is happening, it takes place, but when we appeal to time as the way to exist, the way to do it, then we are wrong. You see, that we must appeal to time when doing ordinary things, right? Technical things. But then it goes over into this area because literal thought has done that. And literal thought has a constant tendency to take over everything, and it has taken over this too, right?
This whole discussion has kind of put a new meaning on a comment that Isaac Newton made in his 80s when someone asked him what he thought of his life, and he said, I've been a little boy walking along a beach, and I picked in and plucked a shell or two, but the whole sea of truth lay before me. It was one of the greatest minds that ever lived, and it seemed like you've put it in a clearer, deeper, different meaning.
There was another thing that people don't quote that he said after that, which is even more to strengthens the point, you see, that you just made, right? And that is, he said, when I was young boy, I was very interested in science, and I asked questions very strong, with great passion. I'm not his words, but I was constantly asking questions about everything in science. And he says, now that I'm approaching death, what would if I had it to do over again, I would ask the questions that are really important. So,
Very well said.
So,
wait till we approach death.
I think we're asking the important questions now.
Yeah, you see that.
We're doing.
You see that's a point that Newton was a man of many styles. You know, he was very interested in alchemy and theology, and which he kept quiet because he was afraid it would discredit his scientific work. But he
was a great mind, it still didn't mean that he had these insights.
Well, yeah.
Can I ask you please to speak a little bit louder, the young gentleman? A little bit louder, I couldn't hear you.
What did you
I
say?
said that even though he was a brilliant mind, he didn't maybe have these insights that we're having, that we're talking about. Maybe that's why he was a very bitter old man when he was in his 80s, so he was looking after the mint.
Yeah, well, yes, I think, he was very disturbed psychologically in many ways. You see, I think his father died when he was a baby, and his mother married when he was young, and when his mother married somebody else, and that man didn't like him, and so he was given to somebody else to take care of. And, it led to a very bad childhood where he grew up with intense feelings of guilt, which he wrote about. And and then he did all this scientific work, but I think at a certain age of about 40 or so, he went through something which would now be called intense depression. You see, he was unable to get on with the scientific work, but he had a lot of good friends, and they got him this job in the mint, right? Which and it kept him going. Every now and then he was able to return to physics and did a few brilliant things, but he wasn't able to do much, keep it up, right? So you see that, so that he got older, and but at the end he had an insight anyway. But it shows that these things are often more complex than they look on the surface. You see that so anyway, we're. I think then that there is possibility there for a transformation of the nature of consciousness, both individually and collectively. It's very important that it happen together, because if some individual changes, it will have very little general effect, you see. But if it happens collectively, then it means a lot more. And and that really is possibly the thing we must say, that it's got to be both. And therefore, this whole question of communication and the ability to dialogue, the ability to participate in communication, you see, which is crucial.
We may have a momentum of that participating thought, and that can affect then the collective literal rigidity. And maybe that can happen at a moment that we can't even measure it chronologically.
Yes, well, I think that when we're able to sustain a dialogue, of this sort, then you would find that there was a change in the people who were taking part, and that they themselves would then behave differently, and even outside this dialogue. And eventually they would spread it, because they might start dialogue groups themselves and so on, you see. That the point is not to establish a fixed dialogue group forever, but long enough to do something, to make a change. But see, if you keep on holding it too long, then maybe it becomes another gets caught in literal habits again. But it may take a couple of years, you see. Well, I'm saying we're exploring this. We're saying, raising the question, can there be? You see, maybe we don't know when or how. Somebody will start one, maybe it's like the seed analogy that, was it you who gave it? Seeds are dropped here and there was in the Bible, and some of them fall on stony ground, and some of them fall in thorns, and so on, and some of them fall in the right place, and they produce tremendous fruit, right? So the thing is that you cannot tell where or how it can start, but the idea here that the communication here, the kind of thought we're having here is a kind of seed which may help this to come about, right?
Each one of us might be a seed to start a group.
Yes, it might be, but then we mustn't be surprised if many of these groups are abortive and don't get going. You see, that doesn't mean it can't happen, right? Yeah.
This catastrophe that we're headed towards might just really be a catalyst to bring about the energy for this mutation.
Well, who knows? I mean, we hope it will serve as a catalyst. You see, if it doesn't, then I don't know what's going to happen.
It has the intention of being a catalyst.
But we hope that it will help to provide an impetus, you see. Now, but in principle, people ought to be doing this without the threat of catastrophe, you see.
You're born, in a sense, it's a catastrophe. So.
If you choose to believe you're heading for a catastrophe, you will be. I mean, I think that's very important to keep that in consciousness. If we choose to see that we're just a few episodes, just observe it.
What if we choose not to see? Would we not be heading for a catastrophe if we chose not to see?
That's right.
Also, the catastrophe might be in the mind right now, as opposed to out there.
Well,
so maybe there's nothing
the mind is being broken down right now, if you want to put it that way, that the mind is degenerating under this pressure of confusion, right? Mm-hmm. Now, but the challenge is, can we suspend it and look at it and be sensitive to it, aware of it, attentiveness and so on.
Supposing what I think is a catastrophe may not be a catastrophe in terms of the unlimited. I mean, how would I know?
Well, the unlimited is not concerned. I mean, in that sense, but I'm saying it's we who are concerned. You see that we haven't. The unlimited thus far is, I say, it's an assumption, or I say it's something that thought has put in there to bring about coherence. If we get quiet enough, perhaps the unlimited will actually work with us. Perhaps it already has. You see, we haven't seen it clearly, huh? Now, the catastrophe, the unlimited will survive. but what?
The unlimited survives. What happens to the human species?
Yeah, that's the question. You see, it may be anything could happen. You see, the species may go, there could be another one. You see, there was an interesting program I saw many years ago about reptiles, showing that they had a long time ago, there was a kind of reptile, they find skeletons, which would be about the size of a human being, which could stand up on its hind legs, and which had 3 opposable claws. And it had a rather large skull. So then they sort of made the fantasy, suppose that the reptiles had not been extinguished, then slowly this reptile changed by evolution. And pretty soon it looked almost like a human being, you see. So the point is that the dolphins also have large brains, and orca whales, even much larger than ours, and a very similar structure. So with some differences. So the point is that it doesn't seem that intelligence is restricted to the human being, that the human being has a highly developed brain. The possibility of thumb and finger opposing with tremendous control, it is able to use this knowledge technically. The dolphin with the same brain, perhaps it might be fundamentally just as intelligent, or but it can't use it, you see. You see that now, and it just enjoys itself, which may make it more intelligent.
Kind of a conceptual sensuality that the brain has been as well caught in.
Why?
I personally found that it gets so much satisfaction out of the literal thought. Get so much satisfaction keeping inventing new methods and new methodology, perpetuating itself, that to the point I said, it's really a very strong conceptual sensuality that it gives you tremendous pleasure that doesn't want even to get out of that.
Yes, well, it does produce. See, it does produce pleasure. This representation, and the body demands it to be continued, and so on. You see, but again, I think that we need to pay attention to that. You see that the thing depends on this little trick whereby the representation becomes the presentation. And see, the pleasure is produced from the memory, and if we once see that it's coming from the memory, it will lose its charm. You see. It's only because we don't see it that it works. You see, now, there's a tremendous mechanism, if you'll observe, to prevent you from seeing it. There's a tremendous distraction mechanism going on to pull your attention away from seeing this simple point, right? In other words, there's a self-protective mechanism in that process which is constantly distracting you, because if you once see the point, you begin to feel the self is going, and then there's a tremendous movement to preserve it, right? Yeah.
So what is this mechanism?
Well, I know. I think it would be late to go into it, but you can see that, look, if you begin to see suppose you say you get a lot of pleasure out of thinking about yourself in a certain role, right? This may come partly, you're representing yourself as very good and so on, and this stirs up the thoughts and the feelings, I would call them felts, the past feelings, so that the pleasure centers are stirred up from the memory, right? Now, but you don't see that happening, so it seems to be, fresh. Huh? Now, suppose you could see it happening, the pleasure would vanish, right? Now, the whole body would react to that, resist, say, let's have that pleasure back. Now, the only way to have it back would be to take your attention off this point, to zap it, to do something, to think something which would either say this is not so, or else to think something else to cover it up or whatever, right? See, so therefore there's a mechanism to prevent you from seeing the key point, which requires sensitive awareness and whatnot, right, and all that, right? So that's the sort of thing you have to do individually. At least you begin that individually, right? That you have to take that very seriously, or you won't do it, you see, because there's all sorts of distractions and all sorts of reasons will come up why you shouldn't go on with it, or something else is more important.
So the question, why is this mechanism there?
Well, this is what's keeping it going. The mechanism is there, we went into that before, you see, because it's necessary to be able to, for the thought to actually be sensed as in the thing. But what the failure is that we don't see that this is happening, and we give it the wrong meaning. We give it too much meaning. And if we by chance begin to see it, there's a mechanism to be sure that we won't see it.
But wonder if you start seeing it and this tremendous fear starts rising. Now,
Well, you see, but the fear is also part of the representation. You see, what are you afraid of? You see, it's being represented to you that something very dangerous may happen, namely the self might go, right?
It's actually a physical thing.
Yeah, but that's true, but that's the whole way it works. I mean, to say that the representation becomes a part of your physical being, right? Right? Therefore, if you can see that happening, then it doesn't mean that much. You see, if you can see that the fear is being produced by the thought.
But David, The fear, I mean, the grappling to get back to what we call stability, to not let it disperse, is you can't fool with that. I mean, then you don't have any choice.
What do you mean?
Well, you can't sit there and look at it because you're just grappling so hard to get back into control.
Yes, I know, but that's part of it's part of our whole representation, that you're there and you have to control. But you see, if you can question that, you see, not necessarily in the worst moment of fear, but when it's subsided, you see. And you can always call up the fear by thinking the thoughts that make it, you see, but in a somewhat weaker way than the full fear. So you can begin to, it's like a piece of machinery. If it's turning slowly, you can see how it works. When it's going very fast, you can't.
That's where the fear of death comes from. You can't fear the unknown. If you don't know it, you can't fear it. But we think we know what death is, and it's the thinking that causes the fear.
That's right. It's the representation of death that you're afraid of, right?
You can't be,
because the representation of death becomes the presentation of death. It seems you know what death is. You're afraid of it, right?
Exactly.
You see, but what the fear is of what is presented from the representation, right? Now, if we can get that clear, then I think the fear will go, you see. Now, I don't say it's going to happen right away or anything like that. In principle, it could happen right away, in an insight. But that's the sort of work that has to be done individually, you see. So I think that it's crucial. It's not enough to work on the individual, and it's not enough to work on the collective. But the two together are the crucial thing. That's what I'm trying to say. So if we had people who would meet and work collectively, and also in between work individually, that would be what is needed.
That's a very big if.
I know it, but it's not impossible.
We've already started.
What?
We've been doing it for 3 days.
We've already started?
We've been doing it for 3 days, 50 people.
Yes, I've been here, but
I mean, we've started. We've started already.
But we go home now, and I don't know how many of you are going to continue a group.
But that's the same story about the seeds, you see, that may fall here or there. You see that. We can't focus too much on that, or we'll just stop, right?
Actually, there are quite a few people doing this. In fact. Yeah.
Also, in last year's tape, I wasn't here, but I listened to the tapes. David goes into that. What you were talking about, the feeling, in terms of if you wait a moment, then you can recreate the feeling, not to the same degree, but then you can look at it. And it's explained very well.
All right, 3 people at least that I know of in this room right now have perhaps experienced this kind of fear that I'm talking about. And there's no grappling with it.
No.
To my notion, as far
fear is the function to keep you from moving.
You see, could I make a suggestion? Yes. That as a matter that the trap comes in the way we talk about it. You see, the thing, and our attempt to deal with it is where we make the trap. You see, that if I say there is no way to do it, then that is never. It's the absolute. You see, it's always never. That is what makes literal thought, right? So I'm saying, let's watch that. You see that? See, the point is that very thought is what makes it gives the. It's a representation which presents it as impossible.
Excuse me, I was not trying to block it with a notion that it couldn't be done. I'm just trying to get through that impasse that seems impassable.
It almost feels like you're dying.
Yeah.
Like going insane or
yeah, I'm not saying don't. I would say don't push it. You see, don't drive yourself into it. But I'm saying, but if you can look at a similar fear in a weaker way, you'll learn something, right? See, the main point is to learn the general way it's working, rather than the detailed winning over victory over a certain kind of fear, right? You see.
Start with very little things like washing the dishes and a little bit of fear or resistance in that.
No, I think what's being suggested is that specific fears relating to something other than the ultimate existence of that structure are trivial in comparison with that.
I'm not sure that's right. You see that?
I'm saying this is being suggested,
Yeah, but
whether it's right or not.
yeah, you see that I would suggest that any fear relating to the self has the same general structure. That fear of loss of money, or fear of loss of self-esteem, or loss of sanity. They're all on the same basis, but they have the same structure. But you don't begin on the thing that you find most difficult, right? Any more than you would begin learning anything that way. You see that there's the same general structure, but begin with some fear that you think you can manage, right? Or at least it seems as if something might happen. Now begin to see the structure, and then it may be possible to go deeper.
It must be fearsome to be talking about it, but it's happening, right?
Not the kind I'm talking
Well, no, we're not the kind you're talking about.
But
We're talking about the same fear.
Maybe the literal thought, once as we are together, and there is our sensitivity comes up, so the subtlety, we start moving in a more subtle level. Maybe the literal fear comes up because the literal thought gets the message. And what about me? The literal thought on which you are functioning as these days, as we're coming together, and we start operating on a subtle and deeper level, the fear comes up together, maybe. I find it very natural, because then the literal thought says, what about me? Because the literal thought, something has to die, or something has to lose, or something has to start faint. Something.
Yeah. Well,
that's the literal thought, the restriction and the rigidity of
yeah,
it.
so that's true. That it is literal thought, which is the trap, you see. But to get free of that literalness, it requires a lot of insight, because it's very strong, you see. Now, well, let me make a suggestion that I think that if you can begin, say the same as in the dialogue, we don't begin with the most serious conflicts between us, but we begin by just talking as far as we can, and the other ones will come up, you see. And the same thing in the individual work. Now, so I think as the hour is getting late, we should come to a conclusion, to an end, right? And
The third thing is, I said that I don't think there are words yet invented to express the deepest gratitude, what you are offering us here. And could we meet more often?
well, thank you. That's within possibilities.
Just say that I think fear is only possible and only comes up in duality. I'm always afraid of something. And if the observer is observed, then there's no fear.
Yeah, so then the question is, to come to that. But I think since we shouldn't really reopen the thing at this stage, since I think people will have to be going somewhere. All right, so anyway, that we'll call the thing to a conclusion and say I appreciate all the attentiveness and work you've been doing, and I think all worked out very well.